Yeah, we'll get started, I guess, just to introduce ourselves and orient ourselves for this session. Welcome to Exploring and Expanding Methods, Emerging Scholarship in Historic Preservation. My name is Anna Gasha. I am, I say Japanese, Okinawan, and American. And I am a PhD candidate in historic preservation at the Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. And I'll be moderating today, which I am so excited to do. And this session, along with the invitation to moderate, is all thanks to Sarah Marsom, who I just saw, but no longer. Oh, there you are. So thank you so much for sponsoring this this session, Sarah Marsom and the Tiny Activist Project. So we have four wonderful presenters today who are all extremely wonderful, and I think y'all are in for a treat. So they have, studies that are varying from, we're starting in Seattle geographically and ending in Seattle, but we're also gonna visit Philadelphia and the South as well. And so I'll be introducing each of them as we go along, but the hope is to have a pretty substantial question and answer discussion section so that we can kind of have a conversation about all of this at the end. So without further ado, we are starting with Rosa. You want to come up? So Rosa is a recent graduate of Whitman College, where she received a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology with an accompanying minor in religion and a concentration in global studies. For her senior thesis, she carried out an ethnographic research project on Buddhism and cultural identity among the Cambodian American diaspora in the Seattle area. Rosa's primary focus area within anthropology includes Asian American cultural hybridity, especially in the context of migration, religion, and language. So take it away. Thank you.
I don't know if that one's working. Oh, okay. I'll maybe use this one.
All right.
Okay. Oh. This is not the right presentation. Yay, okay, there we go. Okay, perfect. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to our panel today. We're all really excited to share what we have, and I'll be starting us off. So my name is Rosa. And today I'll be presenting on a combination of two different projects that I've worked on: the internship that I did with For Culture, which is a Seattle-based arts and culture organization, and also my undergraduate thesis. So to begin with some context about my internship with For Culture, it was called Equity in Historic Preservation. So essentially this meant that I was learning about the mechanisms behind preservation and reconsidering the grounds upon which sites are deemed significant enough to receive a landmark designation. And in that project, I was looking at sites on Beacon Hill, which is a neighborhood in Seattle. And just before this internship, I finished my thesis. I wrote about the Cambodian American diaspora in the North Seattle area and how processes of identity construction and cultural sustainability are formed through the local Buddhist temples. And one of those temples that I discussed in both of those projects is the subject of today's presentation, Wat Thamachakaram. So I'll start with my approach to historic preservation and why we need to pay particular attention to the exclusion of culturally significant sites. And then as an example, we'll talk more specifically about the temple, what it means to the Cambodian diaspora, and what is risked for the community should the site not be preserved. So for my work with For Culture, I carried out oral history interviews with neighbors to learn about what spaces in their neighborhoods hold cultural significance for them. So essentially this was an ethnographic spin on the traditional preservation survey. So instead of looking through property records, the data that we were interested in gathering was what neighbors thought of their own neighborhoods. And by using this ethnographic approach, we wanted to respond to the inequities within traditional preservation practice and demonstrate how the application of anthropological methods could be a tool for equitably preserving space. So prior to this project, I did not know anything about historic preservation at all. I just wanted an internship after I graduated. So in addition to speaking with neighbors, I also met with local preservationists and learned a lot more about the field than I already knew. And through those conversations, I was really frustrated to learn that cultural significance is a negligible part of preservation practice, and that there is no substantial mechanism within preservation to assess culture. because for the most part, criteria for landmark designations emphasize technical architectural details or affiliation with the famous designer, and the way that preservationists are trained don't provide the skills to assess culture. And because of this focus on architecture, we end up with a minimal record of vernacular buildings, but these are the places that belong to and provide for minority communities that end up, yes, getting erased from the record, but also literally physically demolished and then replaced. And I feel that there is something important about that tactile, tangible component of preservation specifically that is interesting when it comes to cultural heritage. So this is where my anthropological training came through, because it was obvious to me what the methodological gaps are and how social scientists can fill this need, because to my thinking, if you want to know what is culturally significant about a community, you should just ask the people who live there. But this is just not the methodology that preservationists are taught, and it's only really a straightforward research question if you know how to ask it. And the issue that this line of questioning presents for traditional preservationists is that it reallocates the control that they've had in deciding what places deserve to be preserved and then restores that decision-making ability in the community. So in working towards this standard of community-centered preservation, we had a two-pronged goal to identify sites to document principally on the basis of cultural significance to communities whose histories have been excluded from the landmarking process, and we aimed to do so by way of affirming the credibility of neighbors as the primary knowledge bearers and stakeholders for their communities, not necessarily cultural resource management professionals. So I think this is an older version of the presentation, so I'll patchwork what I have here. So the temple is located in Beacon Hill. It's an extraordinarily diverse community. This map here shows the general boundary of the neighborhood and all the sites that I looked at. Right now, the star is the Wat, and we are right up there where that orange dot is, so we're relatively close to Beacon Hill. Here we go. According to the city of Seattle, about 75% of Beacon Hill residents identify as Black, Indigenous, or as a person of color, and about 39% identify as Asian, which are distinctly higher percentages than the rest of the city. And in reviewing the history of development in Beacon Hill, the neighborhood has continuously been rearranged by various development projects. And as of 2020, 44% of Beacon Hill's population was made up of immigrants and refugees. Communities that already have sensitive relationships with home and place. And this realization was really impactful for me in thinking about the long-term dimension of displacement, because for these neighbors, displacement doesn't just end with migration from a home country to the United States, but the pressures of gentrification make placemaking a perpetual process for them. And these impacts are precisely why historic preservation has a responsibility to amend this fraught ethical relationship that it has with displacement that oftentimes goes ignored in preservation circles. So a starting point for this work is to document the personal histories of the neighborhood while longtime community members and the places that they care about still exist, which is what I aimed to do in this project. So introducing the Wat. So Wat Dhamma Chakaram, it's colloquially known as Wat Jah, which means Old Temple in Khmer. It's the oldest Cambodian Buddhist temple in Washington State. It was founded in 1982. There aren't many people who hold the institutional memory of the Wat, and one of them is Larry Sang, who is the previous president of the Khmer Buddhist Society, the overseeing board. And in a coincidence of great methodological convenience to me, he's also my uncle. So I carried out an oral history interview with him, and he told me that it all started in 1982 when a group of Khmer refugees living on Beacon Hill pooled their money to buy a single-family home for their new temple. And 10 years later, after the original building was lost in a fire, they had to rebuild a new structure, which is the Wat that we have today. And then in 2008, an ongoing lawsuit amongst the temple leadership, coupled with a second fire, closed the temple's doors for years, and all gatherings ceased. Monks were relocated from the site, and they put a locked chain link fence around the property. And after years of closure, Sang was determined to reestablish the core of the Khmer community. So in May of 2011, starting in May of 2011, for a year, he navigated the bureaucratic maze of getting the Wat's paperwork in order and also rebuilding the space itself. And then finally, in the summer of 2012, Wat Jah was reopened to the community. So Cambodia has a long history with Buddhism. About 97% of the population practices, so many Cambodian traditions are deeply linked with Buddhism, and the significance of a Wat as a site of social organization can only be fully understood after acknowledging how Cambodian Buddhism is uniquely marked by the Khmer Rouge period, because during this time, Buddhism was intentionally, explicitly, and violently dismantled, and people were forced to abandon their Buddhist identities and practices as a means of survival. Yet ultimately, the temple has prevailed as a place to gather. So for Cambodian immigrants, in addition to being a social guide in the diaspora, the Wat also serves as a vehicle for the preservation of a culture that was nearly destroyed. And this role is especially important for diasporic populations. Many of the Cambodian Americans that I spoke with expressed how their visits to the temple were core childhood experiences and marked their relationships with their families and their Khmer identities. And one of my interviewees put this really beautifully, I thought, in saying that the Wat is a place to be with your people and a place of belonging and home. Our parents have difficult and negative memories of what Sruk Khmer was like, and so being at the Wat is a way for them to be home with all the good things and all the good people. And this role is particularly salient for Wats in less densely populated diasporic communities. So Seattle actually has the third largest population of Cambodians in the United States, but within the Seattle area, much of that community resides to the south of the city. But to the north, where I grew up, the population is much sparser. So the Wat is the only cultural resource that is specific to the Cambodian community. And so for me, the Wat was the only venue that I could go to really feel Khmer and to learn about Cambodian culture and to connect with heritage and see other Cambodian people who were not just my family. And so this space presents a rare opportunity to foster Cambodian kinship and decelerate cultural loss. So looking forward, Wat Jah is up against climbing property values across Beacon Hill, and because the Wat is funded only by its congregation, this looming threat is on the minds of temple leadership. My uncle actually personally refinanced his own home in order to purchase a parcel that went up for sale right by the Wat. And so he has hopes to build a Cambodian community center on the site, offer Khmer language classes for the youth and caregiving for the elders. And at the end of the day, his goal is just a sense of stability and peace for his community. I don't have my conclusion notes, but I can say them out loud instead. So my work with For Culture, the goal ultimately was to elevate the value of community perspectives that have been obscured by the system of preservation that doesn't have them in mind. And by having this record of culturally significant sites, I believe that we have the evidence to affirm these places as deserving of preservation, not just as built locations, but as representatives of these communities that deserve longevity and stability. And one way that we can do that is through this oral history work. And this is also a time-sensitive project. So it's important for us to document these stories before they're expelled from these communities and as we work towards amending our systems towards a standard of equity. So thank you.
Hello? Okay, this works. Thank you so much, Rosa. Up next is Calvin Nguyen, who is currently the Indianapolis Preservation Coordinator at Indiana Landmarks. He has a Bachelor of Arts from UC Berkeley in American Studies, and then went on to earn his Master of Science in Historic Preservation from the University of Pennsylvania, where he was also an intern at Penn's Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites. He also completed recently a Sally Crest Tompkins Fellowship with the National Park Service in 2023, for which he completed a historic American landscape survey report in Los Angeles' Chinatown. And today he will be presenting on Philly.
Thank you. Yeah, so today I'm presenting my research on a Vietnamese American commercial in South Philadelphia, referred to some as Philadelphia's Little Saigon. I asked two overarching questions throughout my research. First, how is place important to Vietnamese American heritage, culture, and identity? And second, how can we preserve the built environment's significance to Vietnamese Americans? My methodology included researching the urban history of the area, analyzing its built forms and spatial organization through photography, ethnography, and site visits, and interviewing various business owners and community organizers. So, where is Philadelphia's Little Saigon? There are no definite boundaries, but it's roughly between Broad and 5th Streets, orbiting around the main thoroughfare of Washington Avenue. There are about 80 Vietnamese-oriented businesses and institutions in the neighborhood, which offer a range of social, cultural, economic, culinary, and religious experiences in a variety of built forms. unlike other ethnic enclaves, the Vietnamese institutions here are pretty discontiguous. Instead of a solitary landmass, it's more of an archipelago. In fact, it should be noted that there are significant African American, Latin American, and other Asian American communities and institutions that exist among and between Philadelphia's Little Saigon. But for today, I'll be focusing on its importance to Vietnamese Americans in hopes of not oversimplifying the space or its community, but highlighting how Vietnamese American heritage and culture in particular play out. In looking at Washington Avenue, I worked through 3 ways of understanding the built environment. The first is symbolic, and this is what most traditional preservation practices center and act upon: architectural forms as symbols of the past, where preserving a building equates to preserving its history. The second is experiential, and this brings people into the equation. It's not just, is that pho restaurant's facade the same as it was 30 years ago? It's, how does that pho restaurant still serve pho? Who is eating there? What languages are being spoken? And third is processual. And this is about the social, economic, cultural, and ecological processes that make those symbols and experiences possible. These processes are both evident in and supported through the built environment. Take fish sauce, for example. Producing, shipping, selling, buying, cooking, and eating fish sauce in part hinges on specific spatial arrangements in the built environment, while also influencing how that built environment is experienced as heritage. In a way, fish sauce and the journey it takes is a character-defining feature of Washington Avenue, more so than any pedimented cornices or original wooden windows. Now, I'd like to take you through Washington Avenue, best I can, through 4 ways of looking at the built environment. The first is adapted row houses, which is how Vietnamese businesses first appeared in the area. By the fall of 1975, a Vietnamese restaurant had opened inside a row house in South Philadelphia. And by 1982, an identifiable Vietnamese community operated and resided in these inherited buildings. Today, these Vietnamese institutions boast several levels of alteration to the ground floors, ranging from simply tacking on a Vietnamese sign to interrupting the architectural language of the Philadelphia row house altogether. For example, by cladding the brick exterior with polished black granite. These alterations to late 19th and early 20th century row houses underscore Little Saigon as a Vietnamese American cultural landscape, rewriting and appending historic significance in the built environment. They show that change, even ones that would make the Secretary of Interior standards shiver, can prove to enhance historic integrity. The next is mini malls. These have become increasingly important spaces, not only in Vietnamese American, but Asian American culture and heritage across the country. On Washington Avenue, there were 3 built in the 1990s to respond to an increasing Vietnamese and Asian American population, particularly in the surrounding suburbs. Their ample parking lots provide access to this more car-oriented community, while at the same time becoming an unconventional public square. For example, during Lunar New Year, people crowded the parking lots to watch lion dance performances, something that can't really happen on the sidewalks of Washington Avenue. These mini malls provide an uninterrupted density of Vietnamese American businesses and an added layer of insulation from the public street. One business owner says that on a slow summer day, neighboring shops will sit outside their storefronts and converse with one another. Newspaper stands are stocked with the latest Vietnamese magazine's issue, and a Buddhist nun solicits donations and offers reliquaries in return. Though private in ownership, these mini malls help facilitate a particularly Vietnamese American public sphere. Next is signage, which is a really crucial and cost-effective way to claim space. These signs speak a different language than the rest of Philadelphia. Red and yellow are predominantly used, culturally significant colors that visually tether one shop to another several blocks away. And then there are other types of signs, which can be more ephemeral, but just as effective in marking culture. Bulletin boards that advertise job openings or apartments in Vietnamese, posters for Vietnamese concerts. A sign offering flu shots in Vietnamese flags a medical clinic as a safe space for those with limited English skills or preference for Eastern medical practices. These signs can also be political, and flags can be signs too. They keep the memory and spirit of South Vietnam alive, whether by flying the old South Vietnamese flag or simply printing South Vietnam, gone but not forgotten, and planting that in the ground. And finally, we have interiors. Many may seem ordinary, but they construct a specific experience that affirms and celebrates Vietnamese culture. For example, knowing how to incorporate the different sauces, vegetables, garnishes, offered into your meal relies on cultural knowledge of these culinary artifacts. The same being true for shopping at a grocery store. Vietnamese restaurants often hang up framed pictures and paintings of Vietnam, both remembering and celebrating the Vietnamese landscape. Interiors can create total places of belonging. In this example, the presence of Buddhist shrines and reliquaries in restaurants represents a culturally Buddhist Vietnam. It frames a space not only in economic terms, but as a place to, and I say this only half jokingly, eat, pray, love. So, how can preservationists support Washington Avenue's varied significance to Vietnamese Americans? In 2019, Hoa Binh Plaza, the first Asian-oriented mini mall in the tri-state area, began the process of being bought out by an outside developer who planned to evict its commercial tenants, demolish the building, and create a mid-rise apartment complex in its place. The community has since pushed back without much success. Looking more broadly, property values in the zip code have increased by roughly 50% between 2014 and 2021. As of May 2023, over half a dozen construction projects dot Washington Avenue east of Broad Street, mid-rise, mixed-use, and residential buildings that threaten to accelerate changes in scale, property values, and community members. This narrative of change is not unique to Philadelphia's Washington Avenue and is shared by many APIA neighborhoods across the country. As preservationists, how do we manage that change? I think the answer lies in working to prevent what one of my former professors calls crisis-inducing cultural breaks. This requires us to think not only about preserving built forms of heritage, but also the experiences, processes, and people that buttress cultural heritage in the built environment, from ordering banh mi from a bakery to lighting incense at the temple. To do this, we must expand the traditional preservation toolbox. One way is to look at it in economic terms. How do we give Vietnamese American businesses and institutions, many of which rent their spaces, economic agency to choose where to operate? Another way of looking at it is, how do we make new developments work for the existing community? New buildings and landscapes, even ones that demolish existing buildings and landscapes, can support and strengthen Vietnamese American heritage, culture, and identity on Washington Avenue. The questions that need to be asked is, who does the planning and for whom? Political tools. How do we increase community recognition and provide a real seat at the decision-making table through advocacy, programming, and policies? Community preservation and agency is tantamount to preserving the significance and identity of ethnic neighborhoods such as Washington Avenue. And lastly is a return to preservation tools. Washington Avenue sites and buildings represent, as built forms and experienced cultural landscapes, nearly 50 years, aka the entirety of Vietnamese American history in Philadelphia. Washington Avenue and other little Saigons across America are living spatialized archives, told through the lens of Vietnamese American interventions in and occupancy of the built environment. As preservationists, we must find ways to honor and recognize that history in place, while also making room to sustain it into the future for the next 50 years, when 2 more generations of Vietnamese Americans will have imprinted their own values on the community, and the legacy of Hoa Binh Plaza will only exist in the stories we choose to tell. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Calvin. We have up next Amanda Young. Amanda is a rising senior at Washington University in St. Louis, pursuing majors in history and educational studies. She was inspired by her family history to conduct research on the history of Chinese American education in the Jim Crow South. And she is a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow doing this research. Amanda also volunteers with the Missouri Historical Society's Chinese American Collecting Initiative and previously interned at the 1882 Foundation, OCA Asian Pacific Advocates, and Stop AAPI Hate Youth Campaign. So thanks for being here, Amanda, and go for it.
Thank you. Thanks, Jen. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Amanda. As Anna said, I'm a senior at WashU in St. Louis, but I'm originally from Lafayette, California. And I started working on my project on the history of Chinese American education in the segregated South when I was a freshman. And currently it's my senior thesis project. And it was inspired by my family's history because my grandma was born in Lake Village, Arkansas, and she grew up in Houston, Texas. So I was just really curious as a college student. I knew racial segregation in the context of Black and white communities, and I was kind of wondering where families like mine, like Chinese communities fit into this dynamic. And it turns out that it was pretty complicated. And so that is what I have been researching for the past few years. It's grounded in the Mississippi Delta and in Houston, but the map, so this is Mississippi Delta, and then Houston is down here, but this map shows you some other locations that Chinese families were located in the South as well. So as we know, during Jim Crow segregation, laws were mandating separate schools for white and colored students, but that language led to some ambiguity. And so in 1927, the Leung family of Rosedale, Mississippi, challenged the school board's decision to remove their two children from the white public school. And ultimately, this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, who upheld the decision that it was up to the states to segregate. So despite that ruling, many Chinese students did go to white public schools throughout the South, where it was not forbidden legally, but also in towns in Mississippi, some leaders were more accommodating. And so I'm really thinking about how Chinese communities were interacting with the racial hierarchy in order for that to happen, how they were kind of navigating both structures of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a bit. But because our session is about exploring and expanding methods, I wanted to talk about my approach to this. So sometimes people are surprised to hear about Chinese people who were living in the segregated South in the early 20th century, rather than maybe California or New York City. And so I've been thinking a lot about why these stories are undertold and why folks don't really know that much about them. And I think that inevitably requires us to confront power dynamics in academic research and thinking about like why these voices have been omitted, why people don't know these stories, and whose voices are in official records and archives, who trusts an archive to steward their family's history, and also in terms of census data, like how people were being categorized and things like that. So really just kind of trying to read between the lines to tell a fuller story. I've also been thinking about different forms of knowledge. And so one of the things I do are oral history interviews. And I think that this is a way to combat some of like the Western or Eurocentric perspectives that uphold the written word. Our elders have so much knowledge, and just because those stories aren't always written down doesn't diminish that at all. And so I think it's really valuable to hear their lived experiences in their own words, especially when thinking about identity and how they were kind of navigating both identities imposed upon them and also identities that they felt were significant themselves. And so in doing oral history interviews, it's also important to build trust in relationships with your interviewees. I did want to point out, this is the Mississippi Delta Chinese Heritage Museum, which was an archive that I visited. And just thinking about like who trusts an archive to steward their family's history. This was an archive that came about 10 years ago because of community action. And there are Chinese Americans who are from these regions that are still sitting on the board today and really doing a lot of great work there. So in terms of the actual methods I'm using, as I mentioned, I do oral history interviews. And this is a photo of me with a man named George G, who I interviewed over the phone, but I actually got to meet him in person last fall, which was really cool. I've also done archival research at Rice University, Delta State University, through collections that elders like George have given to me, and also local newspapers. And this is a photo from the Cleveland Chinese Mission School, which is one place that they went to school. And the other way that I'm going about my research is through site visits. And so I've gotten the chance to visit Houston, the Mississippi Delta, Arkansas, and also Memphis, Tennessee. And those trips have really given me a better understanding of space and place. And I think it's one thing for somebody to tell me in an interview, like, oh, my neighborhood was segregated across this railroad. But then when I get to go and actually see how the neighborhood was segregated and just kind of feel the legacies of segregation, that's really, really powerful personally. And this photo is showing the site of the Cleveland School. So this is when it was in action, and this is what it is today. This was a photo I took earlier this summer. And then the marker was put up in 2012, again, because of community action. So there's been a lot of efforts in these regions to kind of document these histories. So the question that I started with was, where did Chinese people go to school in the segregated South? And so I'll talk a little bit about that now. Some people had private tutors, and these were often provided by the local white school district or the local church. And they would go to school usually with a group of Chinese students who had also been excluded from the area's white public schools. In the Mississippi Delta, the First Baptist Church helped fundraise a lot of the time, and they would purchase land and hire teachers for the Chinese mission school. And so there were big ones, especially in, in Greenville, you can see this is a class, and also in Cleveland, that one actually had a dorm and like a softball field. It was pretty big kind of endeavor. But the Chinese community actually also hired somebody to teach the language and culture to their students after school. So the kids would go to school in the morning and learn like English and American customs, and they would go to school in the evening or afternoon to learn Chinese language and things like that. And so, as I mentioned, also they did go to white public schools, even though legally they were not supposed to. And so, in order for that to happen, they really had to maintain positive relationships with white community leaders and following the segregation norms, kind of rejecting association with their Black neighbors, and just maintaining good favor with the local white folks who ran the town, because if somebody spoke up, they could then be removed from the town, which is kind of what happened in the Lum versus Rice case. Just a quote that highlights that last point. This is from an interview I did with a woman who was born in Greenville, Mississippi, and she was talking about how kids knew they had to follow these rules regarding racial segregation. For example, there was no interracial dating, and biracial families like Chinese and Black families were often shunned from these communities as well. Otherwise, they could be asked to leave town by the white leaders, which did happen, or by their own Chinese community members. And one of the things that she said was they didn't want to upset the apple cart for everybody else. So it was just kind of like a very vulnerable and like tenuous place to be. So this next quote highlights an experience in a white public school. So there was obviously a lot of variety in people's experiences that they shared with me. Some people were experiencing a lot of taunts or just feeling generally invisible. But this person that I interviewed was a very accomplished football player. And so he said that he was able to find belonging and kind of a better social status through that involvement. And just touching on that last idea of belonging, so despite this spatial and cultural isolation, the Chinese community was able to maintain bonds with each other. So as I mentioned earlier, there were Chinese language lessons and like culture lessons at school. There were also social events that were held throughout the community. Sometimes they would drive 2 to 3 hours to go to different dances and things like that. The Lucky 11 was a club established in the Mississippi Delta. It was actually established by a group of 11 boys at Mississippi State University, but they would hold an annual dance and they actually crowned a Lucky 11 sweetheart every year. And the Dragonaires were a group in Houston, and they had a publication called APIAHiP. They also hosted dances and picnics and sports events and things like that. And oftentimes, so those might have been like more irregular occurrences, but the families would play mahjong after their grocery stores had closed, usually on Sundays. And so, yes, despite relative isolation, culture and community were very important to their livelihoods.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. And our last presenter is Sam Leung. Yeah, Sam. Sam is an architectural designer who explores the relationship between architecture, preservation, and education, and engages with how design can expand the potential for cultural expression and sustainable community building. Sam earned his Bachelor of Architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design, with 2 minors in theory and history of art and design and nature, culture, sustainability studies. It's a mouthful.
Art history, sustainability, yeah.
A lot of words. But he has received he received the AIA Diversity Advancement Scholarship, and the floor is yours. But sorry, actually, just to catch everyone up. After this will be the discussion and Q&A session. So get your questions ready, and we'll be getting to that after Sam's wonderful presentation. All right, sorry,
Thank you, Anna.
it's actually yours now.
Thank you, Anna. And also, I feel like this is a really big full circle moment for us to think about, especially we've heard this morning, what does the future of preservation look like? And what does it mean to push beyond the traditional norms of historic preservation? And we're all here today because we know that the limitations of historic preservation are rooted in its origins in architecture and its relationship with how it idolizes certain things that aren't necessarily cultural and that aren't specific to communities. And so through these numerous methods that we've looked through and have been thinking about. I also come from an architecture background, so it's a little bit weird of a relationship, but especially if you think about Maya Lin's biggest archive now, one that's transnational and global, her What is Missing archive that thinks about all of the different things that are about to go extinct in this world. Sometimes it's those things that are most worth preserving. So today I'll be sharing my thesis work from RISD that looks closely at the Panama Hotel. And hi, Jan. Thank you for joining us today. If you guys don't know, Jan Johnson is the owner and steward of the hotel for over, I believe, 60 years now. And yes. And we're very grateful for her and for the service to the community, and especially for preserving the histories and stories of Seattle, Japantown. Now, before we begin, I want us to consider, how do we interact with architecture? Or sorry, how do we interact with history? Is it through a museum? Is it through other forms of design? And when we're the ways that exhibition should come together and the history that it should tell, the design of it often is a powerful tool that can shape the ways that we interact. And especially at Forum today, we have the incredible opportunity to consider carefully how we present histories. So let's start with a photo narrative. I like to start with this photo. The caption at the bottom here says that it's from Dearborn and 12th Ave. And if you try to get there today, you'll be confused. There's no crossing streets anymore there. In fact, there's a bridge. And if you want to be at the crossing spot where this photo was taken, you'll be 90 feet up in the air. And we'll look. This photo actually is from the very front of the Wing Museum. You might have passed by it without noticing, but it's the very first photo. And this is what actually inspired me to really look closely at the photos and the ways that we represent. Now we have a panorama. This is from 1891. You can see the railroad tracks from Oregon that continue all the way up to Vancouver. And, sorry, this huge waterway here is actually the Duwamish waterway. And this huge hill that you see here is actually what used to connect Beacon Hill and First Hill. And we call these hills because, in fact, I mean, they are hills. And Seattle is a glacier formation, or remnants of a glacier formation. And this Chinatown International District we see today took all of that land here and pushed it into the Duwamish River. And from the Jackson regrade, really transformed the shape of this neighborhood. And then here you can see the towers. But that wasn't the only time was demolished and rebuilt. With the interstate construction nearing completion, and finally, as well, the stadiums in the background. And so we'll get a closer look at the regrade if we look at King Street Station Clock Tower. Now, this is the earliest photo that I could find, but it's right around the start of the Jackson Street regrade in 1907. And if you keep an eye out right here, that's actually where we're sitting today. Now, this is before, but just 1 year later, before they're even finished. Jackson, King, and Weller, from the shoreline all the way up to 12th or up to 16th Ave, all of that was demolished in terms of creating land infill and real estate development. And you can see here at the bottom where King Street Station sits today, or the light rail if you took it today. Here's the small aerial view of post-war Japantown. And finally, the view today, and you can see the iconic Chinatown Gate, and of course, the Wing Loop Museum where we are today. Now, we don't have all day to talk about all this history, but we'll just talk about current day Japantown, and we'll start on Jackson Street. Now, this is the image of the first Japanese Baptist church in 1900. And here are the Sunday school kids lined up on Maynard. The regrade threatened to demolish the building, but fortunately, church members were able to fundraise for a house movers company, in fact. And here's the here's the flyer. They made headlines to save the structure. Now, after the regrade and after the structure was saved, and after, of course, hundreds of millions of cubic feet of dirt were moved, the church finally moved to a different location, and today sits combined as part of a mixed-use commercial and residential building. And even after all these years, Jackson Street remains the hub of Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Vietnamese communities that all have called Jackson Street home. And so earlier this morning, you also heard that the Nguyen Museum is expanding its campus to one of the last remaining single-family homes. And so they might just be in plain sight. Now we'll talk about the opposite corner, 6th Ave and Main Street. On the opposite corner is newly completed in 1911 Saburo Osaza, Seattle's first Asian American architect who designed the Panama Hotel, which adapted the SRO, single residence occupancy typology, to a Japanese American community with a bathhouse or a sento in the basement. It sat at the corner of annual seafair festivities at the center of Obon, when the Betsuin was still on 6th and Main across from the hotel. It's a little peek of the bookstore. And it was even scarred by the construction of I-5. I know this is not the right corner, but this was the only view that matched. And here's the repair. And then finally, the opposite two corners of the block were redeveloped, but the Panama still stays. And so we've really looked through a lot of images together today, and we've stitched together a visual map of Japanese American history in Seattle. But this was only because we were able to have all of these pictures together. A story that individual photos, when pieced together, transcend space and time. By looking closely, when we face these two, we'll look at these two businesses that were facing each other. It's the Mitsuwara bookstore and the Pacific Printing Company. These moments, these photos that we've been looking at really show history in multiple ways, from street life in Japantown to family business dynamics. And we're just so fortunate that some of these places still exist today. Now this brings us to the Panama Hotel. I know I'm running a little over time, but we'll make it through. This thesis proposes that the start of the Japanese American Museum of Seattle starts at the corner of 6th and Main. To break this down a little bit, the proposal focuses on 3 key display elements, each communicating history in a different way. The first, and of course, this is a little bit of an overview just of how it might look. But within this proposal, the first of 3, the first element you encounter is a timeline of landscapes capturing the development of the Chinatown International District. After all, histories are complex and require different perspectives. Why shouldn't our viewers also try to find their own perspectives? This inverted panorama forces the viewers to walk around, to find their perspective, to read history. The second element bridges an exterior and interior photograph, scaling up to allow audiences to walk through the image and look closely at artifacts. By enlarging the images and creating the space to weave in physical artifacts, we can relate those narratives back to the images that we found them from. Finally, the third and final element that we've considered is crossing a current and historic image of Jackson Street onto the wall. Upon entering the exhibit, you can see the historical image from afar, but when leaving, you realize that's actually the street that you walk on every day. Sometimes we forget too easily that history is sitting right in front of us. We'll just skip through here. With the opportunity to form a living museum of Japanese American history in the Panama Hotel's continued lifespan, the story of Japanese Americans in Seattle should be exhibited in a format that reflects its complicated social political history. Beyond the physical artifact, of the archived images and documents, visitors should feel engaged in the active conversations and memories that exist because of these artifacts. And ultimately, we should be reminded of the present nature of history and why it should remain relevant to us. After all, history is something that we can interact with, something that can be looked closely at, and most importantly, something to learn from. Thank you. And this wouldn't have been possible without all of, I'd like to acknowledge all of the people. This is not a conclusive list, but it's just a few of the people that have been able to support me throughout all of this work.
Okay, so now we've gotten through the presentations. We would like to start the discussion section where we're going to reconvene this group and kind of pick their brains about, what methods are possible and where are we going in historic preservation. We picked up this kind of idea of methods because everyone in their own way was challenging kind of the tools that they were using, realizing the limitations of the traditional or existing tools that preservationists usually depend on. So I just wanted to kind of pick up on that thread first to kick us off in the discussion, and then we'll turn to audience questions, so get them ready. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of go over a little bit more closely what you were enabled to do by choosing methods. I think all of you in different ways approached collecting information, validating information, categorizing, different types of heritage and kind of understanding it in different groups and presenting it to the public in very kind of innovative ways. So in trying to come up with these new methods, like what did that empower you to do? But on the flip side, like what were the challenges of doing that and possibly limitations that you encountered? Does anyone want to start us off?
Hello, okay, I can start us off. Well, for my particular research, because I had just graduated right before I did this research, and I thought that everybody just thought anthropologically, but turns out that's something that I got a degree in specifically and took classes in and so forth. So, and partially coming out of graduating in anthropology, it's like, oh my God, am I ever going to find a job, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was really empowering for me to step into culture. And they were like, wow, we love your anthropological sensibilities. This is exactly what we need in this field of research. And I'm like, okay, great. This is perfect. So in a way, it felt very natural to me to apply that. I think part of the challenge was learning about the differences between oral history interviews and ethnographic interviews. And also I have a background in journalism, and there's a different type of way that you go about a journalistic interview. And credit to my advisor, Emily Lawson, who has a background in oral history, who we did specific workshops in how oral history interviews take up a different tone than ethnographic interviews, and are much less transactional than ethnography or journalism can be. And just in the essence of oral history, it is to empower the narrator in their story, and you are kind of just carrying it forth for them. So, yeah.
I think kind of on the flip side of things, I don't come from an anthropology background. And so a lot of my studies and the programs I went through really look at the built form and kind of like what are the architectural features that we need to save, and thinking of historic integrity through physical terms. And so I think a lot of the way I constructed and ended up doing my project was thinking about how people factor into it, and how the built environment is still core to historic significance, but that it's a different sort of relationship, and it's not, you can't derive significance just from looking at a building without people inhabiting it. I think one of my most valuable site visits was going to a restaurant and just eating there, and just sitting and watching other people eat, and how they interact with wait staff or how they interact with their food, what music is playing, what they're looking at. And I think that's a really valuable way of looking at interiors rather than looking at maybe the more formal architectural features.
I think to the first part of the question, how it's empowered me, I would say being able to just like listen to people's stories and also give them a platform to share their stories has been really, really special. And that's also allowed me, because it's kind of part of my family history, to contextualize like where I came from and what I'm doing here and like how I kind of fit into these broader histories of American history. It's been really special, yeah, just to talk to folks. Some people are like, not a lot of people have asked me about this, or not that many people want to know about this. There was one person who came to my grandparents' house, and we sat down for 6 hours, just straight, and we were just talking, and he was showing me things. And so I think that providing that opportunity to people has been extremely gratifying and humbling. I also think on the limitation side, sometimes doing this work can take kind of an emotional toll, because you're thinking about your family's history and how they were grappling with like structures that weren't built for them, and structures that are like actively still discriminating against folks. And so I think just kind of balancing both those forces has been really empowering, but also sometimes something that I think about a lot.
So I come from an architecture background. And oftentimes people will be like, oh, yes, of course, I feel like that's very related to preservation. But at the same time, it's the spaces that we're looking at and the spaces that we're dealing with have been ignored from the broader range of historic preservation discussion because it's deemed architecturally irrelevant, or because it doesn't have those architectural details that they're looking for, or the histories that they're looking for. But it's sitting there right in front of us. And with especially one of the difficulties that I found in my research was this photo on the left side from the Densho archives that showed Obon happening on 6th Ave. And it's like we can say that we know the addresses and that we know the people and we have these histories, but sometimes people just need to like be able to see the picture. And I think by trying to expand the ways that we consider, I mean, an image, after all, is just another representation. Like we can think of it as a very sacred object. We can think of it as something that is the truth, something that is that we can't change, and something that like has to remain crystallized in the past. But the problem with that is that we don't relate it to places that still exist today, or places where it might not exist, but at least the land still stays there. And I think because we have, I mean, sometimes we don't even have the photos. It's like, that's what we're working with. And we have to really, really try to find other ways to document and to be able to prove to ourselves and to other people now that it's really, we are important.
Last comments on that? Otherwise, we're gonna turn to y'all, and I can come around with the microphone just to make sure everyone hears everyone else's questions. We'll start in the back.
Hello. Thank you for all your presentations. That was very inspiring. I come from higher education, Cal Poly Pomona, and I just love that you all had interdisciplinary approaches and methods to looking at history. So my question is, you're relatively young, and when we talk about Asian American histories here, I'm a first generation immigrant. I come from the Philippines, you can tell by the accent. But I noticed that it starts only here, that somehow the connection to the motherland is either erased, devalued. And so my question to you all is, have you gone back to where your parents, your grandparents came from? And because the reason I asked that, I wouldn't be surprised if the way that you see the environment, I come from the College of Environmental Design, and so the way that you perceive the environment once you go back to the motherland will be so different. smells, scents, feeling on your skin, things like that that we don't usually talk about. So that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been great if my graduate program funded me to go back to Vietnam for a month. But no, I think that's a really important question. And personally, I haven't gone back to Vietnam since I was 3, so it's been over 20 years. But that was a question I was trying to answer, and I didn't really include it in my presentation, but there is part of my research talking about the built forms of strip malls and how that there's some similarities to that in Vietnamese modernist architecture. And even though that might not be intentional, I don't think it is intentional. I think there's still kind of similarities that you can draw in experience. And then the other part of it is relying on speaking to community members that came from Vietnam, either as refugees or migrants, and understanding their experience. And a lot of it was them saying that they didn't feel Vietnamese until they went to one of these restaurants, right? It was a place to see yourself. And like you said, I think the built environment is more than just visual. It's about taste, it's about smell, right? And like you get hit with a scent of when you walk into a restaurant. That's a really important part of the built environment that I think, again, I think we all think about. We're all thinking about different ways that the built environment isn't really addressed and cultural heritage isn't really addressed. And yeah, I think that's one of the ways.
The way I thought the question was going to go was more about like connections to the homeland. So I was just going to mention that some people actually did send their kids back to China to go to school for a few years, and then they would come back. I have not been back, or I've never been to China. My family, so my dad and my grandpa are both from Hawaii. My mom is from Singapore. Her parents are from Singapore and Malaysia, and so my like Chinese diaspora extends pretty far. And unfortunately, I've never been back, but I've seen some photos of like the villages that folks are coming from, and I would love to go one day. So yeah.
That is a great question. Right now I'm taking Khmer classes. It's really hard. Khmer has like the second longest alphabet in the world. It's like, okay, I can do this, I guess. And I am hoping to spend a substantial amount of time in Cambodia. I'm applying to a Fulbright program right now, fingers crossed, we'll see how it goes. But I've thought a lot about what it would be like for me to spend a more substantial amount of time in Cambodia, especially because so much of my experience of being Cambodian in the United States is mediated through my family. So if there is like a dish that they just didn't like, I will have never heard about it before. It's that kind of, so that's, I mean, it's like I could just go to Cambodia, but I'm wanting kind of the structure to be able to explore culturally more independently from the sensibilities of my family. I guess I used to think that all Cambodian people were just like my family, and it's like, no, that's a very broad generalization to make. And a piece of my thesis work also is looking at the inherent differences in Buddhist temples in Cambodia and in the United States. And there's just different affordances in terms of like the work week. Like we can't celebrate holidays on the days that they actually are because we have a second shift to work or something like that. And so it's kind of trying to fit in Buddhism into the American lifestyle, which ends up changing the tradition in a lot of different ways. So there's ways that it kind of adapts and is preserved, and there's kind of that wonky dynamic between the two. So I would love to go to Cambodia.
So to speak on my experience a little bit, I'm actually not Japanese, nor am I Japanese American. And so I actually didn't know growing up that there's a Japantown in Seattle. I didn't know that this was the third largest. I mean, we talk about California having the last 3 remaining historic Japantowns in the continental United States: San Francisco, San Jose, LA. But Seattle, in fact, Japantown is still here, still has been here. So I'll start here by saying there are actually 4 historic Japantowns remaining in the continental United States. But okay, yeah, I'm also not Japanese. So how does this work? My parents, I'm still not Japanese. My parents are first generation immigrants, and so they came from Hong Kong, and the connection that I really had to here was coming here on weekends or shopping at the markets, and so for me it was really a process of trying to find where Asian Americans are still alive, and I mean we're all still alive, but where we still exist and where we still find value in our spaces. And I think that it's also been challenging for me, not coming from the culture or coming from not having any personal connections really, but it's through Jan, it's through Eric, Molly, it's these people that have these extended connections in the community that have been able to be so open and accepting to new ideas and to really finding other ways that we can have more people involved in preserving our work.
I just wanted to add one more thing if there's time for that. Something that I mentioned in my research, and I think has came up in some of the other presentations, was and also the generally the forum that we're at right now, is feeling Khmer or feeling like you belong in the ethnic identity that you are, or so forth. And in relation to the idea of going back to Cambodia, I am a mixed race Cambodian person. No one ever looks at me and is like, this is a Cambodian person. So the idea, or all I mean, even Khmer, people who don't speak Khmer, there's a lot of different ways that you feel kind of like a discontinuous identity crisis. And so in thinking about going back to Cambodia, it's not an immediate or obvious plug of like, oh, I fit right in here, because I don't necessarily look the part, but also I was raised in the United States and people can clock that right away. Even my mom, who immigrated to the US in the 90s, when she goes back to Cambodia, they can tell that she's been living in the United States. So it's not as easy as just going back and then you derive that great sense of belonging that we all clamor for. So it's a little more complicated than that. Just want to add that.
Hi, y'all are incredibly impressive. First and foremost, I want to affirm you. So my name is Karina. I'm with Latinos and Heritage Conservation, and we're currently navigating a lot of the ways that we use similar methodologies and have difficult conversations as well. And I'm curious from all of you, especially oral histories and stuff like that. And if the response is, I don't know, I'm still navigating as well, that's fair. But ideally, what does your next steps look like? Where would you like to host this information? Especially for things like oral histories and sometimes more personal information where individuals don't want that to be out in the public for public view yet. What does that look like for all of you moving forward?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I mentioned in my presentation that there's not a lot of research about Watchak that is written down anywhere. And it's like, okay, let's finally do that and write it down. And now it's preserved in a way through a Four Cultures archive. It's also just in my Google Drive, so I am needing a place to put it. I mean, I'm hoping to go to grad school. I'm hoping to do more oral history work. And in terms of working with the people that you're speaking with, I mean, just what we were talking about, oral history is kind of privileging the wishes of the narrator that you're speaking to. It kind of is all dependent on what they want to do about it. And I guess that's kind of the pickle with archives too, because it's like, it's in a basement somewhere. It's like, there are more creative ways I think that we can go about using the material that we have in archives, like Sam's presentation of stitching all of these different photos together. Like there are ways that we can repurpose what we have in archives so that it's not just in a basement and that it is reaching the people that would benefit from that information. So.
So I was like telling Calvin, I was like, you don't do oral histories, do you? So I think that it is something that I'm still navigating. One of the things is I like try to do things like this where I get to share some of the research that I've done with other people. Also, last summer I did an internship at the 1882 Foundation, which is a public history organization in DC based in their Chinatown, and they have a series called Talk Story, which is a lot about kind of like preserving community knowledge and just like providing a forum for folks to share their stories and very like kind of casual and like public facing events. I do also want to go to graduate school. I'm in a program that's meant to help diversify the academy. So like, woo. But I really, I like my goal is that I would love to be a professor, but I also know that I like public facing work is really, really important to me. And so whatever kind of place that I am able to end up, I just really want to be able to keep amplifying stories. Like the elders like take the time to share their stories with me, and I don't want it to just be sitting in my brain or on my desktop drive or something like that.
So I didn't conduct any oral histories, but I did reference a lot from Densho's archives. And I think the ways that it was helpful, it might be relevant in that a lot of the times I was mostly I could like sit and like watch through the interviews, but they also had transcripts of all the interviews. So I was able to read through those more closely. And I was also able to, because Densho's hosting platform also lists the copyright usage, and each entry has its own, like sometimes it's the whole archive or each individual archive has a different level, but sometimes each individual artifact also has its own level of copyright usage, whether it's free public domain or it's good free for educational use, or if you have to request for permission to view it. And so I think the tiered level of access helped me piece together what photos I was able to use for like something like this, where I'm altering the image, or other images that are more personal that it's just good for reference, but I shouldn't be using it as like an altered digital image.
All right, unless someone at APIAHiP tells me otherwise, I think we have time for one or two more questions. We're good? Okay, awesome.
Thank you. So I am from Colorado, and we are getting ready to update our survey plan. And I'm in a city that is the most diverse city in the state, and we have the largest Asian population as well. And I really see us doing a lot of community outreach, and we want to landmark not necessarily buildings, but possibly sites that are significant to the Immigrant and Refugee Commission or community. So my question to you all is, having done oral histories and so forth, like we have a lot of resources through the city with translation and that kind of thing. But do you feel that like there are language barriers that you lose some of the message or the story they're trying to tell? And how do you deal with that? Because again, these are people who have not been included in the history for so long, and I want to change that. And so I want to do this the right way, which is why I'm here.
Thank you for your question. I currently work in an ESL program at Edmonds Community College, and working through inherent language barriers is something that's just like part of the job. And also thinking about the research that some of my interviews I did in Khmer, but my Khmer is maybe intermediate at best. But a goal of mine moving forward is to get better at Khmer and then be able to carry out interviews fully in Khmer, because you're right, there is a lot of meaning that is lost when someone is telling the story of their life not in the language that is their first language. And so I guess it would kind of depend on what you're looking for specifically. Having resources for language translation is a really great starting point, I think. It depends on if you're sending out like a survey, it's like who's the kind of person that's gonna see a survey and want to fill it out. So there's different kinds of methods to go about it. But I would say that if you were able to, something that's really helpful at the community college is that we have people who we have like 10 languages covered on our staff. And granted, it's like, oh, the one person who speaks Farsi and the one person who speaks Ukrainian and so forth. But I think having someone who is there who is fluent and is able to mediate those conversations is really helpful. So if you have the money for it, hiring interns who speak different languages that are able to mediate those conversations, I think would be a good starting point. Yeah, printed material in different languages. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. Good luck.
I think one thing to consider is that a lot of times, especially with minority communities, there's apprehension with surveying and landmarking, because that it means potentially increased kind of restrictions. And so I think education is a big part of it, and kind of meeting them where they're at and moving at the speed of trust, and laying out exactly what landmarking might mean. And I don't know exactly what it would mean in Colorado, but talking about the benefits, but then also being kind of holistic about what it could all entail for that community or for the property owners and occupants in those sites.
I don't speak another language, so all my interviews have been in English. And sometimes the folks that I interview, they're also mostly second, sometimes third generation Americans. But sometimes they have like dialects or sayings that they like will reference, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't understand it. So they will kind of explain it through a little bit more. I was gonna say, even though we're speaking the same language, though, like sometimes there is like a disconnect in understanding. I remember I was interviewing a woman, and in my head, I was like, okay, so a neighborhood is segregated. It's like, where did you live in this neighborhood? And she was kind of getting frustrated with me because I kept asking her this question in different words. Finally, she was like, the neighborhood isn't like what you're thinking of as a neighborhood. Like it was a very small town. There was like one row of like stores. Like we just lived here. Like it wasn't really in the neighborhood. And so I was like, okay, like that helps me a lot. Like I was like coming at it from a different perspective. Because even though this is like my family history, I'm still an outsider to the community. I think that the thing that has been really nice is that I do, like, because it is my family's history, I can kind of explain to them why I'm interested in this. Also, when you like tell them like, oh, I'm working on a school project, they're like, oh yeah, like let me help you with this. But yeah, just I think being like very like open about why you want to learn this is something that I've been trying to do, and just like building that trust. And also that is helpful because then other people will be like, oh, like my friend, like you can talk to them, and then I can reach out like that way. It's like, I think snowball sampling is the official kind of research terminology. But yeah, I appreciate your question. I think it's something that I'm still kind of trying to work through, even though there isn't necessarily a language barrier, but it's just kind of about like more expansive ideas of understanding and like kind of finding common ground and common thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, I think word of mouth is oftentimes the most powerful referral, and the trust that comes from a referral from someone who knows someone else. That's honestly how a lot of my connections had happened in terms of trying to piece together larger stories, and especially Calvin's point of knowing the expectations going into an interview and going into a conversation is really important. And it's like, I don't have the funding to build a new Japantown. I don't have the funding to do a lot of the things that people are thinking about. So especially when starting conversations, it's very important for me and for them to have an understanding of why are we even talking, and what we're hoping to achieve.
Oh, they actually need to set up for the next thing in this room. So unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. I know there's still a lot of questions, but they're around. So please catch them and ask them your questions. I'm sure I don't want to speak for you, but I think you'll be happy to answer. And so thank you so much again for your attention and for coming to this panel. Thank you again to Sarah for putting this all together. And yeah, that's all we have. So thanks again.